In this report, understanding exactly how solar cells work, the fundamental limits to their efficiency, and answering a common question from you. How come EVs don't actually come out of the box with a big fat bank of solar cells on the roof? Coming up, the beer garden physics deep dive into photovoltaics and why the idea of putting a photovoltaic array on an EV seems like a perfect fit, but it really doesn't pass the sniff test. Sorry, armchair dreamers, dude, I really am. I'm John Cadogan from AutoExpert.com.au and I get new cars cheap for buyers here in Australia. Website for that, obviously. Or you can just click the photon-powered photovoltaic card that's up there now, dude. This question is inspired by a dude in the comments named James McLean. Got a question. With all these EV coming out like these, why don't they have a roof with a built-in solar panel? Especially when you think about the charge times and, like I get, going green, but come on, get real, we use coal power stations in Oz predominantly. Did the designers just forget the obvious? No, James, they did not. They probably thought about this in R&D for about 10 minutes before deciding that it was pretty much a fool's errand. It's completely impractical, however nice it seems. You can figure this out pretty quickly with a pen and a napkin and an engineering degree, and I'm tipping most of you watching right now have 2 out of 3 on this, which sadly is insufficient to get a pass on this one. So, if you give me the next several minutes, whatever it takes, I will reward you with a beer garden PhD in applied photovoltaics. And I think we all want that. This will help you understand rooftop solar at home as well, like how does it actually work and what are its fundamental limitations and things of this nature. And because we're talking about photons and the spectrum and spooky subatomic interaction generally, how about we get a tired old kind of related automotive myth and knee it firmly in the nuts as well? That's always nice. You know those people, generally beard strokers in my experience, who spent most of school asleep dreaming of Red Bush Mountain, who claim that black cars are substantially hotter than white cars in summer out there in the sun? Yeah, well, they're full of shit, basically. And if you want to know why, just keep watching. I'm going to give James's question 13 points out of a possible 10 here, and not because it's a great idea, spoiler alert, to put a photovoltaic array on the roof of an EV. It's not. It's kind of pointless. But because he asked a foundational question that gets humanity ahead. We don't advance unless people say, why don't they do blah, right? Why don't they do that? And it's not even a negative if the answer is good reasons, dude. Because if you eliminate unproductive ideas, you're left with more productive ideas and the joint rockets ahead. And essentially, that's what engineering and science is all about. So if you like mathematics and physics, you should go through the intracranial bleeds and all of the other pain that it takes to get qualified and detain yourself with a useful, productive life, figuring out how to make humanity better. End of sermon. Let's understand photovoltaic arrays, because you probably walk around your suburb. You see all those photovoltaic arrays up on the roofs, right? And maybe you haven't got much of an idea about how they work and what's really going on under the hood. After this, you will not be able to say that, okay? And the place to start is batteries, because we all know batteries. We use batteries. They're in our phones. They're in our friggin' laptops. They're in all this stuff. A battery is just, philosophically, a box that differentiates electrical charge, okay? You get electrons on one side and you get positive charges on the other side, and then when you connect the wires and introduce an electrical load, shit happens. That's how batteries roll, okay? The obvious example is battery in torch. Nothing's connected to it. Press button on back, connect the load, boom, whole bunch of photons rocket out at the speed of light, and then electrons flow down the wires through the LED in the pointy end of your torch here and out onto whatever you're trying to illuminate. And then over time, if you leave the thing switched on, more and more electrons which have accumulated here rocket down the wire and they come down here, and you get to the point where the charge is no longer differentiated like that. It's more or less balanced and the battery is flat and it needs to be recharged. And of course, you can make a battery in a laboratory, like a kiddie's laboratory at school. They do that as an experiment. But it's not very convenient, right, to walk around with a beaker and a couple of probes in it and like an acidic liquid and a few wires connected. That's wholly impractical, unworkable. So they tend to make batteries more or less like that. That's kind of the battery that just came out of that torch, or it's the same battery as is in that torch. And it's a productionized version of beaker with electrodes coming out and wires attached. So what they do is they put a probe down here and then they put the other electrode like a hollow sort of tube around the other side. And you've got to remember all this stuff if you want to get qualified, right? At engineering or science or any of that stuff. And it's a complete pain in the ass because in the moment, you don't really care about it. And yet you have to remember cathodes and anodes and all of this stuff. Reduction occurs at the cathode and it's a positive thing, right? Red cat plus. There's all these mnemonics you can use, but I find that it's helpful to tell yourself the most crass stories about these things, and then you can never forget it. The more crass, the better. It aids in retention. Don't ask me why. Maybe it's just a unique character defect of mine, but I suspect not. So here we go. What happens here, ultimately, is that when your battery is charged in the torch, right, it's got a whole bunch of electrons, and they're, all just pumped up and ready to go. And they're right around the negative end of the battery, which is this blue bit here, okay? And there's like a graphite rod or something down the middle coming off the pointy bit in the top. Okay? And what happens is when you turn the switch on your torch, the battery just poops electrons spontaneously. It's like the worst dysentery ever, only with subatomic particles. And they come out down the bottom, battery pooping electrons, processing them through the load, which would be LED boy, just here. Okay? Let me get you a focused view of that. There you go. Processing them through the LED, whooshka, speed of light, like that. Very magical. Like, go back a few hundred years, show the dudes there, you'd be a magician. And then it eats the electrons that it just pooped via the pointy end here. It just eats them. And then the battery goes flat and you pump it up again. So the battery poops electrons out of its anus, processes them, and eats them. How dignified. And A goes with anus and anode, and you can never forget that. You'll never forget that again. The anode is the negative one where all of the electrons accumulate waiting to be pooped like dysentery, only productively for human use. So there's that. A photovoltaic array, like a solar cell, is oddly similar, although it lacks the capacity to store energy. Sun shines, you get voltage. If you don't use it, goes away. It doesn't have any storage capacity. And you've heard of silicon chips and semiconductors and things of that nature. Well, silicon is one of those kind of unique elements. It's got 4 electrons in its outer shell, and that's kind of balanced because it's got spaces for 8, so it's half full or half empty, depending on how you view the glass on a subatomic level. And what they do to make a photovoltaic array as opposed to a computer chip is they dope the silicon. And they use different elements. So the silicon is essentially, in a solar cell, it's in a 3-way. Continuing our crass analogy, it's in a 3-way with something like boron and something like antimony or phosphorus. And all that does, when you dope silicon with boron, you make it receptive to being positively charged. Okay? And when you dope it with this other crap that you really don't have to understand, it just makes it receptive to being negative. And the region in between the two doped bits becomes a kind of one-way valve, okay, called a depletion layer or a band gap. And essentially it means electrons can accumulate down here and they can't really travel back. And the mechanism for making these electrons accumulate, unlike a battery where it's just electrons that you pumped in earlier when device was on charger. It's sunlight, or it doesn't have to be sunlight, it's just light, okay? It's photons, it's photon bombardment. And what happens is a photon comes down here, and if it's that lucky lottery-winning photon, all right, it hits one of the silicon atoms in this crystalline matrix in the top layer, and it dislodges an electron. And because this region is predisposed to becoming positive, it likes rejecting electrons. So it shoots it through this barrier here, which only really allows electrons to go one way if it's that lucky electron. I mean, not all photons become lucky like that. Not all electrons become lucky like that. Some of them are just reabsorbed in here, but enough of them get transmitted through this glorified one-way sort of non-return valve, and they accumulate over on this side, which is predisposed to becoming positive. And then you've got a little, semiconductor wafer that's operating not unlike a battery. So then what you've got to do is you've got to join a couple of metal plates to it, metal contacts go in here, and then all of a sudden you've got a path for electrons to flow if you connect an electrical load, all right? Which would be just like a wire with a thing on it. It can be a torch, it can be a big battery at home that you charge up so that you've got electricity when the sun goes on the other side of the world inconveniently, like it does every friggin' night, okay? So in this respect, it's really just not unlike a battery, except it doesn't have the capacity to store energy. You can only use it when the sun is there, bombarding the top layer with photons and ejecting those electrons and pumping them over here. Then you're good to go. When it's all dark, you've got no photons, it's basically just a complete inert waste of time. One of the big problems here is imperfection, right? The world is not perfect, because if the world were friggin' perfect, you'd get all of those photons all dislodging an electron, you get 100% conversion efficiency, and there'd be no loss of energy anywhere, except the universe doesn't work like that. So there are plenty of limitations on the efficiency of solar cells, all right? And the first one is obviously that when you glue little pieces of metal to make the contacts to allow the electricity to flow, you're covering up those bits of silicon underneath. And if you cover them up, they can't get hit by those billions of frigging photons that would otherwise bombard the surface of that silicon. And ultimately, you lose about 8% of available energy just because you need to have contacts on the silicon wafers to extract the electricity. So that's kind of inconvenient. And then not all photons get lucky. Okay, like the universe knees them in the nuts even, right? They spend hundreds of thousands of years in the sun waiting to erupt, and then they spend whatever it is, 500 or 600 seconds transferring themselves from the surface of the sun to the friggin' earth, and then they finally get here hundreds of thousands of years later, and they don't all get lucky. Don't you hate that? Anyway, the photon can do three things when it interacts with anything, okay? It can get reflected, okay? Or it can get absorbed, right? I guess it could pass through as well in the case of glass, okay? But in the case of a photovoltaic cell, it can get reflected. And you know there are photons being reflected off photovoltaic cells because you can see them, right? If they weren't getting reflected, you wouldn't be able to see them. You'd just literally see a black hole. You'd see the absence of light. So plenty of photons are being reflected from every photovoltaic array that you've ever seen. And some of them get absorbed and they just produce heat. They don't knock electrons out of the way, because when you jump up on the roof and you touch a photovoltaic array on a hot summer's day, it's warm, okay? And it's because some of those photons that don't get reflected get absorbed, and all they do is they spend their energy going into the material and becoming heat. All right? And then finally, you get those lucky photons that hit in just the Goldilocks spot and actually create the photovoltaic effect. So a lot of these photons here, they're just wasted and they're never going to produce electricity. Now, shortly after the Big Bang, when God said, let there be light. And he actually said this, right? You can't have light without this. It's Maxwell's equations. That's just how the universe works, okay? And the inconvenient thing about this is that the whole spectrum, like all of the radiation coming out of the sun, it doesn't produce the photovoltaic effect, right? First thing is that a lot of the spectrum doesn't actually get to the surface of the Earth because different things in the atmosphere absorb different bits of it. If you go up into the International Space Station and you measure the spectrum, you get a really smooth curve like this, okay, without these bumps in it, without these various mountains and valleys, okay? And the reason the valleys are there is because different bits in the atmosphere like CO2 and ozone and water vapor, they absorb bits of the spectrum and they never get down here onto the surface of the Earth, okay? And even then, not all of the spectrum causes the photovoltaic effect. See, you can get the photovoltaic effect in different materials. Silicon is pretty much the Goldilocks one for that. It balances the two different kinds of so-called spectrum losses that we're going to rabbit on about for a few more minutes. Okay, so what happens here is that only this bit of the spectrum causes the photovoltaic effect because every photon's got energy and not every photon's got enough energy to knock one of those electrons out of place. And in practice with silicon, it needs to be light or radiation with a wavelength of more than 1.11 microns or 1,110 nanometers, which is usually how you measure wavelength. Okay, so when you walk around the joint, you see this and that, you're only looking at this bit of the spectrum, right? The visible spectrum, which is about 44% of the total radiation from the sun hitting the Earth. And then there's this 4% of ultraviolet, which gives you a lovely suntan before it destroys your DNA and gives you melanoma. That's only about 4% though, so it's a very small amount of total incident energy from all of that radiation. And then the big one is infrared, which makes you feel warm when you step out into the sun generally, okay? And it's 52% of the spectrum. It's all of this, right? And basically, the photovoltaic effect only happens from here on up, and you lose about 20% of incident energy because the electrons in these photons don't have enough energy to knock, the energy in these photons here don't have enough energy to knock an electron out of place inside that crystalline matrix, all right? And then you've got a problem up here, right? Because this is kind of the Goldilocks amount of energy just here. It's just the right punch to knock the opponent out. It's just a tap on the chin, but it's enough, right? And all over. It's not a super high energy photon like up here, okay? So there's no real advantage in having a super high energy photon doing the job because you only need a packet of energy to nudge that electron out of place. More energy doesn't help here. It gets wasted, and it gets wasted as heat. And the high energy heat from this sort of high energy photon end of the spectrum loses you about 35% of the energy that's otherwise available in these photons as they bombard the silicon, right? So the losses are really starting to mount up here. I think this is actually 19% if you want to get really technical, and that's about 33%. And the loss is technically about 52%. And this is intrinsic to the material, the silicon, and there's nothing you can do about that because there's no better material than silicon, right? So that problem, the 52% loss here from the spectrum, that's not going away anytime soon. There's also a spooky kind of loss with the photovoltaic cell. See, when you get a brand new virgin photovoltaic cell that's been kept in the dark like a friggin' mushroom, and you pull it out of the box, its conversion efficiency is about 20%, meaning the amount of light that hits it, the amount of incident energy from the sun that hits it, you get about 20% of that back as electricity, and you waste 80% of it. If you just let it do its thing for a few hours, like wait until the next day, that efficiency intrinsically drops to 18%. And there's a spooky sort of chemical doping physics explanation for that, but, you know, it doing its job for the first bit just degrades its efficiency. And you might say, well, that's only 2%, it doesn't matter. It's actually 10% of its out-of-the-box efficiency, because losing 2% out of 20% is a loss of 10% the next day, and it stays like that freaking forever. And then there's other considerations as well. Like, this is ideal. This is in a laboratory, right? You've got to produce a solar array, so you've got to protect it from the elements, and you've got to make the installation robust, and you might have to put a layer of glass on top to protect it, and you can see the glass. So the glass is going to reflect photons that might otherwise cause the photovoltaic effect, right? And then there are environmental factors, because you could polish the friggin' thing in one of those laboratories where they all wear the Kydex or whatever it is suits, you know, those laboratory CSI kind of suits. Every time you take that thing out and you put it in the environment, one speck of dust lands on it. The billions of photons that would have hit the silicon wafer, which are blocked by that speck of dust, they don't work anymore, right? So you got your photovoltaic array out there on the roof of your home, or potentially on the roof of your EV. It rains, there's dust in the rain, it dries off. You're going to lose substantial efficiency just by virtue of the fact that we're taking something from the laboratory, where the physics and chemistry can be measured, into the environment, where the environment just tries to fuck with you all the time. That's what the environment does. Now that you understand all of that, I'm going to detain you with one of my pet hatreds, right? It's people who say a black car is so much hotter than a white car when you leave it out in the sun. Okay, you might be even a science teacher at high school, teaching your kids about black and white, black bodies, white bodies, things of that nature, radiation. You might be running experiments on this. And if you want to reach the conclusion that black is hotter than white in the sun, you're off with the fairies, okay? You're completely misinterpreting the physics of this, because colour doesn't matter. It doesn't matter significantly. It might matter a few percent at most, okay? And we're going to go through why. We're going to go through why because you've got your black car or your white car, it doesn't matter, or any other friggin' colour, and it's sitting in the sun. In Australia, middle of summer, it's a really hot day. You might be in Tibooburra. It's 50 friggin' degrees or something, ambient temperature. Okay, the sun's hitting the car, and obviously the car is warming up. Visible light is only 44% of the load of radiation on that car. Invisible light, infrared, ultraviolet, it's 56% of incident radiation on a car sitting in the sun. And I've got to say that infrared and ultraviolet are completely indifferent to the colour. Like, if you're in an Apache helicopter and you're using an infrared scope to find bad guys who are hiding under the trees or something, in the middle of the blackest night ever, you're using infrared because the heat from their bodies will glow up on the scope in the way that visual sort of detection techniques will not, all right? If you're doing that, you're not going to see any colour. You look at a whole bunch of cars in infrared, they're all grey. And guess what? They're all the same grey, unless they've just been operating, in which case the bonnet/hood, America, is going to glow brighter. But if you're just looking in infrared at ambient different coloured pieces of metal on the ground, they all glow the same, dude, because in infrared, all colours are the same. They're sort of middle grey, okay? And same for ultraviolet, which is bugger all of the spectrum in any case, okay? Now, so 56% of the problem, heating the car up, is indifferent to colour, and therefore only 44% of the radiation is in any way impacted by the colour of the car. That's point number one. And when you go into physics, right, they talk about black bodies and radiation and white bodies. That's different to colour, okay? A black body in physics is just a thing that absorbs incident radiation. It's like a black hole, only for all radiation. And a white body is sort of the opposite. It's just a thing. It's like a hypothetical, theoretical construct, and its purpose is to reflect all incident radiation. Black bodies absorb it all, white bodies emit it. There are no black bodies and white bodies in reality. This is just a theoretical construct for the purpose of mathematics, okay? That's all it is, this white and black thing. When you look at white and black, the colour, they're not that. Like, clearly they're not that, because when you look at a black car, you're not seeing a shadow, you're not seeing a black hole. You can see the granular detail of all of the shapes of that car, and you can see, if it's the middle of the day and you're looking down on the bonnet of the car like this and the sun's just here like that, the sun is painfully reflected back into your eyes, okay? You can see the trees or the sunset or some girl in a bikini walking towards you reflected in the side of a black car, okay? Now, if it was absorbing all incident light, you would not be able to do any of those things. So a black car, black coloured car, is not a physics lab black body. It just doesn't work that way, okay? So there is some minor differentiation in the amount of light reflected between a black coloured car and a white coloured car, but it is much less than they talk about, right? A white reflects all the light and black absorbs it all. If black was absorbing it all, dude, your black car would just look like a friggin' shadow. Like, that's how this works. And then there's the final part, which is specific to the thermo effects in cars, okay? Because you've got a roof which is insulated, like it is heavily insulated. And here's how you tell that it's heavily insulated, okay? So you put your hand on the roof of the car in Tibooburra at midday, you burn your hand, okay? And then you get in the car and you put your hand underneath on the roof lining like this, and it's just warm. Okay, it's completely tolerable, unlike the outside surface. Therefore, the insulation in the roof is very effective, all right? And ditto, the sides of the car, like the doors, they're almost thermoses because they've got a layer on the outside and then they've got an insulated sort of layer on the inside. And there's a lot of insulation in cars. It's mainly there to do sort of NVH, noise, vibration and harshness attenuation, but it's a pretty good thermal insulator as well. So there's that. And then you've got the glass, okay? And the glass is kind of interesting because the glass does reflect some incident photons, and it does also absorb some incident photons because you put your hand on the glass. It's quite warm in the middle of a hot sunny day, but really it transmits a lot of them through. They just pass through the glass and they hit the inside of the car. So I'd suggest that the main culprit for heating up the interior of a car in the sun in the middle of the day is the glass. And the colour plays almost no practical role in heating the car up. The metal certainly does, but it's kind of insulated, so it's minor. And then there's most of the spectrum really doesn't see colour, so there's that. And I'd suggest that if you did a scientific test back-to-back on a black car versus a white car in exactly that sort of environment, and you did some ambient air temperature measurement inside the car with a thermocouple, you would not get a meaningful difference. Feel free to argue the toss if you like, but the physics on this is pretty clear. Okay, so let's put all this together and get to the bottom of why it's really not worth putting a photovoltaic array on the roof of an EV, but it might on Yo 4x4 on the road to Dingo Piss Creek, because you might want to just keep your relatively small dual battery setup recharged. There's a big difference between those two things, okay? So I just went out with a tape measure and I measured the useful roof area that might hypothetically be devoted to a solar array on a Triton dual cab utility, which has a pretty big roof area. It's about just under 1 metre wide between the roof rails, and if you ignore the most curved parts of the leading and trailing edges of the roof, you get about 1.2 of length that could be devoted to a photovoltaic array. And that gives you 1.1 square metres, but let's just round that down to 1 square metre just to get the point across, okay? Make the maths easy. Incident solar radiation, middle of the day, Australia, summer, about 1,000 watts for every square metre. So that's about 1,000 watts of photons that can be hitting the roof. Okay. We got our solar array installed at 18% efficiency after the first day of operation. That's going to give us 180 watts, which is not a trivial amount of electricity, but it's not that big. And I'd suggest that we're going to have to take about 30% off there because There's going to be dust on the roof. It's going to be dirty some of the time, like it's going to rain. There's going to be dirt on the roof, and there's going to be industrial fallout if you live in a city, whatever. So I'd suggest that you be flat out getting 120 watts out of a full roof-sized solar array in practice, unless you're totally OCD and polishing it twice a day or something, right? And if you said to yourself, and I'm being really generous here, but if you said there were 6 hours per day of light like that you could literally lunch off, then that's going to be 720 watt hours. And then let's just be generous again and round it up to 800. So 800 watt hours, or 0.8 of a kilowatt hour. And this is super generous, okay? It's a super generous way of looking at it, because most cars, even the cars stored outside, are parked near buildings, near trees, whatever. And inconveniently, the sun friggin' moves, right? So when the sun's just over here like this at 45 degrees and the roof is here like that, then you're really only getting 700 odd watts of incident energy, because it's spread over a greater area, okay? It's got to be dead overhead. And if you live between the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer or something, then occasionally the sun is directly overhead. But if you live here in Sydney or Adelaide or Melbourne or somewhere like that, even Brisbane, the sun never goes directly overhead. So you're always going to be somewhat less than this. And the sun's going to move, and there's going to be clouds, and the tree is going to block the sun for some of the day, or the neighbour's house is, or whatever. Okay, that's just how this works. So you'd be absolutely flat out. You'd be the luckiest dude on earth to get 800 watt hours by virtue of being in the sun for 6 hours a day, every day on average. Okay, and if you look at an EV, like a Kona EV, which I'm familiar with, so I didn't have to look up the specs, it's got a 64 kilowatt hour battery on board. So this amount of electricity, 800 watt hours, in the context of the size of this battery, is 1.3% of the energy on board that you could super generously hope to repump in every day from the array on the roof. It would give you, if you could do that, it would give you 7 kilometres of cruising. Free, if you like, quote unquote free, because it's not really free, and we'll get to that. It's also equivalent to 20 minutes of being plugged into a standard wall outlet via the charging cable that comes with the vehicle. I'm not talking a fast charger. I'm talking about 240 volts, 10 amps, 20 minutes, ballpark, okay? And 20 cents worth of electricity if you're connected to the mains, right? Is it really worth going to all that trouble? Because you've got to R&D it. It's going to pump up the price of the vehicle. Then you've got to productionize that roof, okay? So you've got to install that roof in some way. You've got to do the whole production integration with that project. It's going to add weight, like the roof is going to be heavier, and weight is the enemy. The battery's already really heavy in an EV and quite compromised, which is why they don't go as far as internal combustion vehicles in terms of their overall total possible range in between charges/refills. So every kilo you add is going to detract from the cruising range. So why put a fairly ineffective, sort of inconsequential device that costs millions of dollars to productionize? Why do that when it's going to detract from the range and put greater demands on the battery when you're turning and burning, say, at night? I just don't see the value in doing that. It's also going to detract from the handling dynamics, because more mass upstairs really doesn't help. And the only context that I can actually see for rooftop solar, okay, in a vehicle is for adventurers who need to keep their dual battery set up, charged up as they drive along, because there are plenty of adventuring scenarios where you're driving 8 or 10 hours in perfectly bright, hot sunlight, and that is absolutely ideal for keeping a fairly small battery, like 150 amp hour battery times 12 volts is 2 kilowatt hours or something maximum. So 2 kilowatt hours is a bit different to 64 kilowatt hours, particularly if you are able to pump 800 watt hours back in for 6 hours a day. That's a big chunk of the full charge on your battery, and you are kind of getting it for free as you drive. And the fridge will not stop, and the meat will not spoil, and the beer will be cold when you get to Dingo Piss Creek, and hashtag paradise.